Welcome to The Hype Within, exploring journeys of authentic leadership and growth. On the show, tech leaders will share their stories of developing their leadership skills and challenges they faced along the way. You'll learn about their approaches to self-reflection and personal growth, and how they've been able to build a foundation of authenticity that has propelled them to success. I'm your host, Hana Jacover, B2B marketing leader turned leadership and executive coach. Are you ready to get hyped up? Let's dive in. Hello, leaders. Welcome back. I am so excited for today's guest, and I have been a guest on her podcast as well, and we've had a few conversations. And I am talking about none other than the Corrina Owens, who is the Chief Evangelist Officer at Purple Cork, also an organization that I highly recommend working with, and I have done so myself before. They throw great events virtually, and we'll learn a little bit more about that too. But welcome, Corrina. I'm so happy you're here. I'm so happy to hear about your journey, congratulate you on your new role, and just spend time with you.
Oh my gosh, same. I am just such a fangirl of yours, and I feel like I've made it being on your podcast. So thank you so much for having me.
We've both made it because I've been on yours, you've been on mine. I love leveling up with other women in our careers in tech, because once you get connected and you kind of start looking at opportunities for each other and bringing each other along for the journey, I just think it's so empowering, and I'm grateful to have you by my side on my journey and watch you as well on yours.
I couldn't agree more.
Well, why don't you start by giving us a little bit of an intro to who you are in your journey within your career and leadership and all that good stuff.
Sure. So my name is Corrina Owens, and I am currently, and have been for the past 13 plus years, serving as a marketing leader for predominantly SaaS corporations. But my background's actually in education. So I actually did teach abroad for a little while in Costa Rica, and still look on that very, very fondly as just very critical moment in my life for perspective, introspectiveness, and just how I show up in the world. Came back to the States when there was a recession. So there was thousands of teachers looking for jobs and maybe only one or two positions available. So quickly pivoted and got into business. And my first role was actually in private equity, which was a huge, huge crash course in the underbelly of corporate America. But realized that my passion was kind of always in helping others and finding a way to do that in business. My alignment seemed to be best suited for marketing roles. So I quickly pivoted to find an organization that would support that and bring on somebody that doesn't have the traditional background. And the rest is kind of history.
Amazing. That's such an interesting background. I didn't know that about you, coming from education and entering into tech, and of all places, going into PE. Oh my God. What's one of the biggest takeaways from your time in PE?
Oh, that's a tricky one for me to answer. But I would say that I really quickly realized what people actually mean to corporations, how they really are looked at from a line item perspective, and not much beyond that. It's a pretty volatile environment, maybe not across all, but in the ones that I was exposed to. And it's not a well-kept secret. The environment, once you're in it, is pretty just direct. There's a pretty solid cookie cutter model for how these firms are run, and probably due for a little bit of a revamp.
Probably. Definitely.
Yes. Yes.
It reminds me of the TikTok that I posted this morning, and I was talking about how I have been watching Trolls lately because I have a 5-year-old and he likes Trolls. Oh, Trolls. Trolls is a great movie, by the way. But I was the more that I watch this movie, the more that I'm starting to really understand this plot line between the Trolls and the Bergens. And the Bergens are the ones that need to eat the Trolls to maintain their happiness, to feel happiness. It's the only way that they feel joy. And I'm oh, wow. Oh, wow. Wait a second.
Hmm.
I had a big realization there. And I'm like, oh, I see what they did there.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That is very, very prevalent. Yes.
Anyways, at least we get to be the trolls, and the trolls are
They like to have fun. They like to color their hair. They like
yeah,
to dance.
yeah. We know how to bring joy and happiness and love to others.
Exactly.
Speaking of which, through your leadership and all of your years career-wise, but even education, how would you describe your leadership style?
Yeah. I've always had to, even from teaching, take a very entrepreneurial mindset to how I show up and work. Like just taking teaching, for example, especially abroad too, we just have such limited resources available to us. So the focus, right, people would think is like show up to the classroom, create a great lesson plan, learn how to teach to multiple different learning styles, go. When in reality, it's riddled with politics and you have to get buy-in from absolutely everybody. So not just administration, but boards and government and the parents, and then other faculty that are also working to shape the child's education. So for me, it was definitely a lesson in how can I be most effective at my job, which should be to successfully teach these wonderful children at pivotal moments in their lives, provide them with all the necessities that they need: safety, shelter, food, education, etc. But also the way for me to do that is also to have all these other relationships in tandem be really successful for me. So being able to successfully ask for a parent-teacher conference and successfully communicate to the parents what the child's needs are in a way that will benefit the child, successfully communicate to the board and administration on the needs for more paper or, a special trip, etc. So it really helped me with just interpersonal skills and how to appeal to other people. So I've always had this very entrepreneurial mindset so that when I did step into companies as a marketer, I instantly sought out who are my peers in finance, who are my peers in HR, who are my people on the executive team that I need to appeal to in order to get my job done, who are people on the development team that have completely different metrics and KPIs than I do, but will be helpful for me to understand so I can maybe get some needs met with them later on for any kind of marketing promotions I may need to do. So it's always been about like relationships and people first. And so whether I was mentoring or whether I had a direct report or whether I was just a solo marketer, I do feel like I was super intentional about how I showed up as even individual leader with all these different other leaders. And that really came down to just being incredibly empathetic and aware about what are their needs, what does success mean for them in this job, in this role at this company, and how can I best partner with them in order to be successful in my role.
I feel like that's such a great display of two things. One being just transferable skills, right? Like you came from a completely different industry, but you can see that this is still so core to what you needed to be doing to be successful to help these children succeed. And then the second piece is not only is it just relationships, because people will always say like, nurture your networks, like build relationships, understand who the players are, but it's bigger than that. Like it's you understanding the organizational networks and the system that you're operating in so you can see the pathway to achieving what you're looking to achieve and who you need to go through, who you need to go to, who you need to influence. I just think that that's really powerful, and it goes beyond just the basic build relationships advice.
Yeah, and you said that much more beautifully than I did, but you're exactly right. Like just hearing you say that back to me, I would walk into these organizations and kind of take that as my first initiative, is to really understand my roles, right? Like if that's what I'm doing and that's what I have positioned myself to be a leader in, apply for the job, I know I have that skill set. But what I don't know walking into an organization is the reality of like how I fit into that. And the only way for me to understand that is to really unpack and dissect all of these different other areas that I am not proficient in, but can be if I just take the time and initiative to understand and learn it a bit better. And of course, there's some selfish needs there, right? Like I'm learning, to your point, of how I can best fit in and get things done and get things accomplished. But it's also just incredibly helpful for these other individuals too, to have a peer of their, to have a peer that's not in their department. They're also able to get things done. They're also able to get things recognized too. And it is something that I still don't find many people doing that a lot. I don't get sought out all the time either. So I just think it's a really great thing that anybody walking into an organization can do, is to take that interest.
Yeah, absolutely. Thinking about this journey and where you've been, who or what has been your greatest inspiration or influence when it comes to leadership?
I think about this a lot. I think that I've often been in positions where it's kind of that corporate ladder structure where people have been put in positions of leadership because that's the next step to elevate them in the organization. But I've often found that it's come at a cost to me and maybe others that report into those leaders, because if we don't have the wherewithal to ask the right questions or raise our hand for initiatives, raise our hand for help or learnings, we may not get that coaching. We may not get that opportunity to prove ourselves. And so it's so much on the onus of the individual to do it themselves. So I was often looking outside of what was in front of me, because I think additionally too, when I would look around these organizations, I just didn't really fit in from a demographic perspective. I was often the only female. I often was in a very different socioeconomic status than them. My interests were greatly different. So it was hard for me to maybe socialize at the, when we were in the office, like, at the break rooms, et cetera. Just had completely different interests and different life experience. And as much as I tried to fit in, it wasn't going to be maybe a complete fit overall. So I was always looking outside of the organizations I worked at, and was finding a lot of examples at conferences from keynote speakers, or just reading different books that are, some completely about leadership styles and some not, but just finding that I wanted to emulate more of that. And then just taking a lot of chances and asking and raising my hand a lot to try and get in positions where I felt like I could get the support I needed. And I did that by just being very direct about what I wanted and what I needed, and kind of mapping out for my direct managers how I could get there.
Mm-hmm. In a way, it sort of sounds like there's a lot of influence there when it comes to the resources that you sought out. But in a way, it also sounds like you're saying kind of like you are your own inspiration there, like you are the one that chose to go to these conferences and listen to these keynote speakers and take away that message or read those books. And, I think that's really powerful.
It feels really self-serving or egotistical for me to acknowledge that and say that out loud, but it's completely true. It just was this guiding principle that I had at a very young age, that I wanted to see what I was capable of beyond what was presented to me as possible. And, it can be very lonely, but I think that, I've definitely reached a place where I feel like I have found much more like-minded people. And it's really, it's taken, decades, but it's been nice to be surrounded by other people who have also been kind of similar, where they've had to forge the path themselves to find what really felt right.
Yeah. Yeah. One, it's hard to decide to break that mold and figure out what works for yourself versus to just sort of, kind of crumble and be like, okay, I guess I'll change myself, or I'll make myself uncomfortable to fit in with these people that everybody else seems to be inspired by, just because there's not somebody that looks like me or sounds like me or has the same lived experience as me. So I think it takes a lot of courage to just say no, I'm going to find my own way. I'm going to forge my own path on this one.
Thank you. Yeah. And I definitely encourage others to do that, because it's such a hard thing to swallow when you know that you're going against your gut and your intuition about what feels right and what's serving you. It's so hard to do that. It is such an injustice I feel like we can do to ourselves. And even if it's, a path that's unknown or less traveled, it's so much more worth it to bet on yourself and what you think is right for you than to kind of just fit into the mold as, maybe some would rather us do.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. We talked a little bit before, and we've had a lot of conversations about this, actually, thinking about balance and thinking about balance between personal growth and professional growth. I'm a huge fan of talking about this. I don't think it's possible to separate the two of those two things. And I'm curious, throughout your career, how have you maintained that balance for yourself?
Yeah, it's not been perfect. It's been really difficult to find what does balance look like for me, because I think I'm certainly a high achiever and I have really high standards for myself. And very often in my life, I kind of seek for external validation on, my worth and things like that. So that meant that I kind of went above and beyond in, a lot of scenarios, and it would be at the expense of myself. And it would mean ignoring signs of like being so exhausted that I can't think clearly. I start to have short-term memory problems, or completely ignoring my other interests that I had outside of a job or my 9 to 5, and solely focusing on what can I deliver for a company in the hopes that maybe one day like it'll come back for me. And what I've done fairly recently is I've tried to instead ignore that talk track in my brain of, if I get to X, then, I will be seen as a worthwhile marketer or a fantastic candidate or credible enough to whatever that is for you. I've tried to silence that in my own brain, instead say, what feels good to me, and try to ignore any chatter of like, that doesn't matter, because it matters more than anything is what feels good and what feels right to me. And the more that I have focused on listening to my instincts instead of my expectations, or not my instincts, but the more my intuition, the more I focus on my intuition and not my expectations, the more I find that I'm actually getting to the place that I really want to be. And it hasn't been like, balance. Like, I think there's so much talk around like how you structure your day and how you block your calendar, like very little tactical things that can work for people. I found that until I had that true agreement with myself, that those boundaries, even if they were external facing, they weren't being respected, because I would allow them to be disrespected. And I would do that because I wanted to look great for a client, or I wanted to look great for my boss, or I wanted to look great for the company. But ultimately, I would suffer as a result, and it would actually hinder maybe how I showed up in, these environments where I wanted so desperately to be seen as the perfect person, because it really meant that I was suffering in some ways. So I think once I made that agreement with myself that what matters most is how I feel at the end of the day, then the rest kind of does, as cheesy or far off as it sounds, it does start to fall into place.
It's so true. And it's very hard for people to get there, because there is an attraction to doing more and like seeking that external validation and thinking that if I do more, I will receive more, which is not true. I've talked about the inner game on this podcast before, particularly in Kyle Lacey's episode, we talk about it. And part of the inner game is understanding, what does peak performance look like? And part of peak performance is about removing friction. And part of peak performance is also about doing less and less overthinking. And the more you do, the less successful you're actually going to be at reaching your goal. And I just think it's so fascinating, because it happens to me too, where it's like, I think that I have to do more, all these things. But when I just sit back and I listen to my intuition, like there are days where I'm just like, what you need today is rest. What you need today is to not sit in your office, not sit at your computer and do the 20 things that you thought were very important on your to-do list. And what's really fascinating is that when I do those things, when I listen to my intuition, like things come into me, contracts come in, people connect with me while I'm not even thinking about it. And I've heard this from other people too, where it's like they go on vacation, they don't think about work, they shut everything down. And when they come back, they've got signed deals. They've got people that want to connect with them. Like, it really is a formula. Even though it's scary, it is a formula for success. How do you recommend, in your experience, people kind of dip their toe into that? Because it is challenging.
Yeah, and I think it's so challenging because it's this idea that we can control anything in the first place, right? Like, we want to say yes and do more, because I think in our mind, and maybe what, society would like us to think, is that means we're more in control of our destiny. But I think that that's just an illusion, because you just never know what's going to happen. You cannot control everything. And I have just decided, when thinking about small steps here, I think that it really goes back to like really having a contract with yourself versus having contracts with other people. And what I mean by that is, like you said, people get these opportunities, whether they're asking for them or not, where they're not working, then they come to them. And I think it's because you're listening to what feels right for you in the moment. And you naturally, I think, really, you know, I don't know if we want to go into the law of attraction or anything, but I think there's something to that of you're purposely putting something out there that is completely in line with your own instinct, your own intuition. And just the result of that is that you are going to get actually what you want. And so if you're feeling like you need to step away and like you need peace, if you fight that, then you're actually you're fighting with yourself and you're dishonoring yourself. And so you're setting yourself up for friction, maybe not even in the moment, but further down the line, because you're just constantly breaking that agreement with yourself. And I think the most important relationship you have is the one you have with yourself. And it's probably the hardest relationship for most people to have. It certainly is for me. It's taken a long time to really, and I'm always working on it. But when I'm having a good relationship with myself, the rest becomes like side notes, right? Like it's an addition to my life, but I have to have that relationship right first. So I think that little things could be like when you're feeling an urge to want to say yes to something, instead of just jumping at the instinct to instantly say yes and agree to it, stop and with yourself and say, what about me like wants to say yes? Why do I want to say yes to this? How do I feel when I think about saying yes to this? How do I feel when I think about saying no to this? What am I possibly going to be compromising if I say yes or if I say no? And just giving yourself the opportunity to reflect and be, in a state of, because we're always in a state of change. So what you had wanted for yourself, you can probably still achieve it, but maybe not the way you thought you were going to achieve it. But you constantly have to be, I think, evaluating like, where am I today? And how does this feel? And what are the positives, but also what are maybe the drawbacks of me saying yes? So sorry, that was a little bit of a rant to get there.
No, it was great. And I think too, I'm going to take it back to trolls with this, because if I can do a full circle on the trolls thing, I will. Because you mentioned feelings, right? Hopefully some people have seen this movie, the King Bergen or whatever his name is. Eventually the trolls have to convince him that he doesn't need to eat trolls to be happy. He needs to tap into what he's feeling. And I think even a precursor to what you're talking about is understanding your emotions and understanding how things feel. We go around spewing out emotions and how we feel, but we don't actually truly know how that thing feels. And like once King Bergen had the language to pair with the thing that he was feeling inside of his body, and he was like, oh, that's what love is, that's what joy is, it's like glitter sparkle lady or whatever her name is. And then it became this process where he then opened up to understanding the bigger picture. I don't need to control, I don't need to eat these trolls to get that feeling. Like there are other pathways, but I have to start by understanding that feeling and those emotions.
Yeah. No, I think that's beautiful because I think if you think about like, what does it mean for somebody to be successful? I think that so much of what we think is successful is kind of already predefined for us. And we're just agreeing to this belief system that that's what it means to be successful. But we don't often, step back and say, well, now that I've tried some of these things, do I feel successful? Is this bringing me joy? Is this bringing me peace? Is this bringing me a quality of life? Or have I just been told that if I do this, I'll be successful and then that'll bring all these feelings? And to your point, like that's ultimately what we're all trying to get to is how do we feel in this world? Like, and I think so much of that comes back to like feeling safe and secure and loved and appreciated, like just fundamental things. And I think when we, grow up, we're told, especially, in our society, that success is the way to get there. And I don't think we stop enough, as leaders or individuals to say, well, is this actually really going to serve what they're seeking to get? And we just don't reflect on that enough. And I think the more people can do that with things that they're wanting to work towards or they think will make them X feeling, the more we can stop and have that introspective reflection, I think we'll actually maybe start to be more in line with what we're really trying to achieve.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of it too is like going back to knowing yourself, what you said, that relationship is so important. And we don't take time to do that. And when we don't take time, we can't do any of this unless we take time to understand who we are, because we lose ourselves throughout socialization and experiences and all the assumptions and beliefs. There's all the things that get piled on to us. We totally lose who we are. And so taking the time to reconnect and knowing like, oh, this is who I am, I think is an important step in this process. I know you've done this work. We've talked about it a lot, and I've done this work. I help other people do this work for a living. And one thing that I get a lot is whether they come to me for professional development or more on this personal growth side of things, or it's intertwined. It's I don't have the time. I don't have the time for coaching. I don't have the time for therapy. I don't have the time for reflection. And this one drives me crazy because, first of all, everybody's going to distribute their time the way that they want. You are in full control of your time. In fact, if you want to even go one step further, like time is not real. Time is a social construct that we use to measure something. And so if you think about it towards then around energy, right? Like you are choosing, you are making that choice. So how do we convince leaders and maybe even organizations to allow people to, or encourage people to go through this process of putting energy into discovering who you are, putting energy into understanding this relationship so you can get close to your emotions, so you can do the best that you want to do in life and really align. And I'll say as an aside, there's a lot of organizations that don't want you to do that, right? Because it does take you away from them, and it does scare them because they no longer control your outcome, and you might decide to go do something different. And that is an unfortunate part of business and capitalism. But I'll hand it over to you to finish the rest.
Yeah, no, that's such a big one, and I think has been just from every organization I've been at in my career. I mean, I haven't found an organization that's really cracked that yet. And it's tricky because, to your point, I think that the way we promote or nurture development of these leaders, it's all very like one size fits all. There's not a lot of individualization happening. And I think that's because the purpose of what it's serving is, again, not really for the individual, but really for how it fits into the construct of the organization. And I do think, and I've read some studies, none that I can, of course, recite right now off the top of my head, but there is benefits in actually treating the whole, and I'm sure you can speak this too, but actually allowing for somebody to, show up as their whole selves in development opportunities like this, because you're potentially tapping into some talents that they don't feel like they can express, or they haven't been given the freedom to operate that way. And then you're also just setting up what I think to be a much more psychologically safe environment, because you're actually putting the individual at the forefront versus the organization. And I think that anybody walking into performance reviews or coaching plans, they can kind of tell when it's designed for an outcome specifically for the business and not so much the individual. But I think there's so much power in setting up the individual for success in the long run. And I do think that it would end up benefiting the company ultimately, whether they stay with you or not. You're potentially allowing somebody to be their best self somewhere else, right? Versus them being lesser version of themselves, because that eventually I think is going to wear on the employee. That's going to make them feel not recognized, not seen, not worthy. And I think their productivity will go down, and that would directly affect the company.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We have this view of community first, organization first, collective first, when in reality, and like I'll say community and collective are very, very important always, but individual growth has to happen before you can effectively contribute to collective growth or community growth. There's a really interesting story around the Blackfoot tribe and Maslow. And Maslow, in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Maslow spent a lot of time with the Blackfoot tribe, and the Blackfoot tribe actually taught him about their ways. And in part of that teaching, they gave him information around the way that they see that hierarchy. Self-actualization is the very first step. Community's at the top. So Maslow took that and he flipped it and really thought about like social needs first, and then self-actualization is really at the top of Maslow's hierarchy. And I mean, it's not the way that the indigenous people lived. It's not the way that the indigenous people felt was the best route towards community. And I just think it's fascinating to now see like structures and systems set up in this way that really is kind of inverted. And we really should be nurturing that individual level to get to the type of organizational growth or community growth or whatever it is. And so I don't know, I just find that fascinating. And I think it's definitely related to what we're talking about.
Well, I could be wrong, but I would think that the intention for flipping it that way was because there are going to be people in the community that don't need as many resources or help opportunity. That's probably not the bulk of the community, but it's certainly the people that are at the top, right? So I feel like that's somewhat of a self-serving way that most organizations operate, which is how can we continue to take care of the top? Well, we can do that by teaching people that it's all about the community. But what that ends up meaning is the people at the top don't really need as much support as maybe the people that make up the community, but the community is going to inherently benefit the people at the top at the expense of themselves.
Yeah.
Did I say that well?
Yeah, I mean, yes, you did. We're getting into territory where people will probably roll their eyes, but I don't care.
Yes.
And I mean, I actually think that like this is the critical thinking that we need to be doing. If we want to evolve as individuals, as organizations, as humans, you know, whatever layer you want to look at that, like we have to look at the history. We have to look at what we need to break down in order to recreate or completely just scrap, because there's a lot of things wrong with our foundation of how we operate, not only just like in our daily lives outside of work, but work really emulates a lot of that. And I do think that these are important conversations to have where it's like, where do we think this organizational structure even came from, you know, or how are we going to evolve if we just keep doing the same thing over and over again? Well, that requires us then to look back and kind of look at that foundation and see where it's cracked. And I think that it's just an important thing to discuss for sure.
And I think too, if you ever feel like you cannot ask questions freely or that they're not met with judgment or you're kind of casted aside for having asked a question, I always tell people like, it's okay to question the things you love. In fact, you probably question the things you love more than most things, right? So anytime you're questioning these organizations and their systems and their structures, if you're met with any kind of resistance that somehow makes you painted in a negative light for even having the balls to ask those questions, that's a signal for you right there that maybe this is not really serving you or your peers. You should never be looked down upon for questioning things, in my opinion.
Absolutely. And there's a difference between feeling the need for safety and maybe not questioning things because you won't feel safe versus being scared because of the power, being scared to question things because of the fear that something will happen, that there will be backlash. So I always tell people just kind of understand that difference. Are you afraid to ask? Or is it because you really, truly need to keep yourself safe? Because those situations obviously exist. So yeah, I think that's a great point, is to think about what question should I be asking? Can I ask the question? If I can't ask the question, what does that mean to me?
Yeah.
And then go back to what we were talking about, is tapping into your intuition and those emotions and who you are, and asking, does this all align? Or do I need to make a change? Is this a redirection?
Yeah.
Okay, shifting gears a little bit. We went deep there. Stay with me. I've always seen you as a disruptor, just in the way that you move through your career and like how you show up, and you're laughing, but it's true. And I know that you describe yourself that way too. You won't go into those status quo circles. And I'm curious, in the past or now in this new role, how do you intend to disrupt traditional leadership?
Thank you. Yeah, it always feels a little bit funny for me to hear somebody also see that in me. So it's very true, and I stand by it. I'm certainly not one to dim my light or dim my thoughts and opinions, and it's hard to consistently be like that, especially when you get into really powerful circles. But I think what always, just as a side note, what always keeps that forefront for me is that I always just step back and take stock of like my whole lived experience. And it always pales in comparison to when I'm in those moments and it's challenging, and it helps me to have the confidence to continue forward. But I totally understand how intimidating it can be to use your voice and to consistently use your voice, especially when it's met with resistance and pushback. But I think that the way I'm trying to continue to show up that way, and what I really love about where I am today, is I'm always empowered to have an opinion and to give feedback. And it's always with this understanding between me and our founder that my intentions are in the right place, and that everything I'm, giving in this job and in this role for our customers and for, the company is with good intention. I've gotten pretty good at determining who those people are in my professional life, that I feel like there's an understanding of my skill set, what I can offer, and my just intention and who I am as a person. And I think I am able to maintain that with people because I don't really compromise who I am or my belief system. I'm always open for conversation, always. But I think that my integrity is that I am consistently about putting out the best product I can, about having more quality for people at my organization and more visibility for others. And I think that, indirectly that has helped other people to see that I might be somebody worth bringing onto their organization or their team. I try to just stay really true to who I am. And if somebody doesn't want to hear my feedback, or if they don't want to include me in a conversation or organization or circle or what have you, I try to not take that as a slight on me, who I am as my character, but more that this just wasn't the time or the fit. And I tried to not take that inward as much as I did, I think, in the past.
It sounds like staying really close to your why and communicating that, and then allowing others to stay anchored to that throughout the relationship. So like that intention that you say, like they get it, they know your why and they're aligned with that why. So you can have these conversations, which is, in my opinion, the way to build a really powerful relationship. What would you say the best way for somebody to communicate that to somebody so they can build relationships with that type of foundation?
Yeah, I think especially in working environments, I think it's really hard for people to show up really transparently and authentically as themselves, because we're all wearing masks that we feel we have to wear. And I mean, some organizations, pressure that more than others. But I mean, on the onset, I'm making just no apology of who I am, whether I'm working with a vendor or a contractor, whether it's part of my W-2 or whether it's part of something I'm doing, for myself and my own business. I just authentically, I know how cheesy that sounds too, but I show up exactly as who I am. And it starts to weed out things, kind of organically on their own. And that does take quite a bit of courage to do that, because you're not going to be surrounded by a lot of people that are doing the same. You're certainly somebody that's exactly as you are in every medium in every circle that you walk in. And I think that as long as you know your why and what you're doing this for, again, that goes back to your intuition, like you're not compromising this contract that you inherently have with yourself. And so you shouldn't compromise it like with anybody else either. And so, I mean, it can be as simple as if you're in a one-on-one with your manager saying, hey, I don't really do well with the Slack notifications. They kind of get lost. It's kind of hard for me to remember those things. If this is really critically urgent, would it be too much trouble for you to send this to me in an email or to put this on, a Trello board or what have you? And making that just like a regular thing that you communicate what works for you, communicate how you best interpret things and perceive things, and then allowing them the space too to say, okay, sure, I can do that. Or, you know what, this is actually why I'm doing it. Can you make some adjustments maybe to how you're doing things? This is the why behind it. So you're both communicating the whys behind it. But I think just being the person, especially it's hard when you're the person reporting into somebody, but the more you can kind of model what works best for you and the why behind it, it kind of allows somebody else to do the same thing.
I think that in all of the wonderful things that you said, just that piece of being authentic and like what that even means is really important to understand. Last question, thinking about emerging executives who are maybe, high performers, high achievers, loyal to a fault, recovering people pleasers. What is your advice to them to step into all of what we're talking about?
Yeah, I think it means taking an honest look about what have been your perceived views on structures and your life and systems and the way you operate. And then sitting with that and looking back at it and seeing, like, does that really feel good to me? Does that really resonate with me anymore? I think it means taking a hard look at, no matter, like, to your point, but if they're emerging leaders, there's always going to be this notion, I think, in corporate America in particular, for you to continue with the status quo, for you to continue operating the way things have always been. And I feel like, especially for women, that there is such a pull for them to, they've worked so hard to get there. They've gone through all those struggles, all those challenges. They've had to operate in all these places where it hasn't felt comfortable to be themselves, but they finally have made it. And they kind of just want to sit there and bask in that. And it means kind of playing the same game that they've always played. And I totally get why somebody would be so tired and want to just relax and because they've reached this place that they've been working so hard to reach with all the challenges and hurdles. But I would ask that they actually take a look at that and ask themselves, like, having reached that, how much of that, like, is that still working for them? Are they still maybe that younger, fresh out of college professional that really wants to be in that position and that really wants to operate and lead that way? Or have they maybe learned a lot of things along the way and they want things to look a little bit differently, and have the confidence to question it, and then also have the confidence to be a voice for others about it? Because I think that we are so narrow-minded sometimes with how we think about how we show up in the world. And at the end of the day, we never know how much time we have here. And I certainly have had to question myself and take a step back and say, hey, Corrina, is everything you're working on right now, all the blood, sweat, and tears, time, energy, hours, sleepless nights, et cetera, if you had lost your life tomorrow, how much of that would be representative of who you are as a person and what you believe in? And it's not even close to, like, what I stand for and what is important to me and who I am. So it's a hard thing to swallow, and it's a hard thing to challenge because we have so many norms that are preventing us from doing that. But when I have challenged that personally, I shared with you at the top of the call, I have the best balance in my life that I've ever had. And I have this title that I have now, and I wouldn't have thought that I could be where I am, but feel this sense of, like, ownership of my life and autonomy of my life. And I was able to do that because I'd had a really hard, discussion with myself about, as much as I wanted something to work, and this is across many years of my life, it wasn't working that way. And so I had to just let that go. And I had to be at peace with that just not being the case, and instead welcome something a little bit different that was more in line with who I am. And it doesn't matter what that looks like to the outside world. It matters what it looks like to you and the people that matter to you. And I hope that more female leaders in particular can have that difficult conversation with themselves and know that it's not going to be easy and it's not going to be overnight. But I think that the bulk of us would want things to look different for ourselves, our daughters, our future generation, our peers. Like, we would want it to be different at the end of the day. And so we just have to be bold enough to have that conversation with ourselves first. And if you can have that with yourself first, I guarantee you can have it with somebody else. Because if you can face your own challenges and dilemmas with that first, you've got the confidence to do it externally.
Hear, hear. Beautiful, beautiful advice. Thank you so much.
Thank
and
you.
It's okay to play the game, right? Like, it's okay to play the game, but play it strategically and disrupt where you feel like will have the most impact for you. And that's going to allow you to just have balance. You don't have to disrupt all the time. You don't have to play the game all the time, but figure out when you want to do each thing and at what level. Corrina, you are so amazing. Thank you for coming and sharing your wisdom and your words. Like, you're just, the way that you say things, I align with so much and so eloquent. And I know that these are hard conversations to have with people who work in our industry, especially some leaders who work in our industry. But I think that they are necessary, and I think that they are the right conversations to be having right now. And I appreciate you using your voice and being willing to come on and chat with me and keep disrupting, keep being different and breaking the mold and standing in your ground, because whatever you're doing is working, and I'm super proud of you, and I will be right there alongside of you, cheering you on.
Thank you so much. I can't thank you enough. Every interaction I have with you is just a positive one that reinforces so much of what I believe in and what I feel is right. And you provide such a beautiful platform for everybody to just be their authentic selves and their whole selves. So really, thank you for letting me come on here. I appreciate you so much.
You're the best. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode. I hope you walk away with something empowering that you can take into your own leadership journey. Are you a high-performing executive looking to take your career to the next level? Or maybe you're an emerging leader who wants to develop the skills you need to advance in your role and show up authentically. Or maybe you're experiencing burnout and struggling to find a better work-life balance. Whatever your situation is, one-on-one coaching can help you achieve your personal and professional goals. If you're interested in experiencing the power of coaching for yourself, head on over to hypehousecoaching.com/start coaching now, where you can set up a one-on-one leadership and executive coaching intro session for free. Remember, the only hype that really matters is the hype within.